Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining the Holocaust Center for Humanities Lunch and Learn program. I'm Alana Cohn-Kennedy, the Holocaust Center's Director of Education. It's so nice to be back hosting this program. I want to give a huge thank you to Dr. Beth Greek-Palelli, who led the last three programs and coordinated the series America and the Holocaust. We look forward to having her back for additional programs in the spring. Thank you to our community partners on today's program, the Foundation for International Understanding Through Students, and the League of Education Voters. The views, information, or opinions expressed in these programs are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of the Holocaust Center for Humanity. This program is being recorded and will be available on our website starting tomorrow. We at the Holocaust Center for Humanity acknowledge that our Holocaust Center in downtown Seattle is on the ancestral lands of the Duwamish people, the first people of Seattle. The Duwamish are a people who are still here, continuing to honor and bring to light their ancient heritage. We know that through studying the Holocaust, students learn the importance of speaking out for others, the dangers of intolerance and prejudice, and the difference one person can make. We also know that finding reputable and engaging materials on the Holocaust can be challenging. When schools first closed back in March, the Holocaust Center responded quickly, and thanks to generous supporters, we put into place a new program called Book by Book. The Book by Book program sends new books directly to local students for them to keep. Within the first few weeks of the shutdown, we had hundreds of requests. The books are free and are available to any student in Washington State who requests one, no strings attached. We are so pleased to now be expanding this program and making additional titles available. We encourage you to share this information with teachers, students, and others who might benefit from a free book. You can find all the details on our website, holocaustcenterseattle.org. Just click on Book by Book program on the homepage. If one were simply to search for books on the Holocaust, you will find everything from historical studies to memoirs like Elie Wiesel's Night to revisionist history books. Finding reliable information and discerning what is credible is not a new challenge. One conspiracy theory, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, has continued to stick around for more than 100 years. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, written at the turn of the 19th century to incite hatred against Jews, claims to contain the minutes of a secret meeting of Jewish leaders plotting to take over the world. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion was published in 16 languages in countries around the world, including in the United States, as funded by Henry Ford. It's a fake, of course, a myth that has been disproven over and over again. And yet the document's existence continues to resurface, providing fuel to conspiracy theories. It plays on people's fears. No matter what evidence surfaces to prove the document a hoax, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion sticks around, and the book is still available to purchase online. A 2019 research study showed that educated and informed people are just as susceptible to fake news and conspiracy theories. No one is completely immune. Every day we are bombarded with information and misinformation. Just yesterday, I received a breaking news alert from the Seattle Times, warning people to be vigilant about election misinformation. How do we sort through all of this? With us today with tips on how to be reliably informed and what it means to be news literate is John Silva, Director of Education at the News Literacy Project. The News Literacy Project is a national education nonprofit offering nonpartisan independent programs that teach students how to know what to trust in the digital age. John will take questions at the end of the program and maybe even throughout the program. Please type in your questions anytime in the Q&A, which you will find at the bottom of your screen. Thank you so much, John, for being with us today.
Thank you, Alana. I'm really happy to be joining you again. And just before I begin, I'd like to do my own acknowledgement that where I live here in Chicago is the traditional territories of what were known as the three fire peoples, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi peoples, but also that Chicago was once a vital gathering site for trade and cultural exchange for dozens of other Native peoples in the region. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with my presentation here about, obviously you can see what it means to be news literate. So the big idea that we're going to be talking about is how we can sort of take control of our information feeds to practice some new skills and habits so that we can be more reliably and effectively informed, and hopefully as a result, more engaged citizens in our communities. So yes, so I am part of the education team at the News Literacy Project. My primary role is about professional development and training for educators. I do design those trainings, but also resources for them. We have been expanding a lot of our offerings to try to reach out to audiences such as Lunch and Learns from the Holocaust Center for Humanity, talking to the general public. I spend a lot of my time researching misinformation and conspiracy theories and the way they spread and grow, especially on social media today. I am a former classroom teacher. I spent 13 years teaching social studies here in Chicago public schools before I joined the News Literacy Project about 3.5 years ago. If you'd like to reach out to me after today's Lunch and Learn, my email address is there in the lower left-hand corner. And if you are active on Twitter, I do share a lot of the tips and tricks and resources and things there. And that's my handle there if you'd like to give me a follow. So as Alana mentioned, we are a national, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. Our primary focus is about education programs to try to make sure that educators across grade levels and subject areas can teach news literacy so that young people can become active consumers of news and information, but also that they will be active and engaged citizens in the civic life of their community. And we do believe that news literacy should be embedded throughout the American education experience, not just in traditional schools with young people. We need to be talking about all the ways that we educate each other and we educate ourselves. Because news literacy are skills that apply to everyone. It's not just something that's academic, because the reality is that information is the basis for every decision that we make. And if we're not reliably informed, if we are falling victim to misinformation, then we're not going to be making those good decisions. Our values, we do believe that as a life skill, news literacy is something that we all need to learn and practice. And part of what makes this very difficult is that especially in the last couple of years, we are starting to have debates about things like facts. People are arguing in some ways that facts can be debated as opposed to the fact that they just are. So we believe that they matter and they should be prioritized and they should be defended. But one of the most important things that we need to emphasize, and we have seen in recent years, increasing attacks on a free press and on journalists. But we have to acknowledge that defending the free press is an absolute requirement for the health of our democracy. If you want to follow us as an organization, we are very active on social media. We are currently growing, in particular, our Instagram account, but we do share a lot on Twitter and on Facebook as well. And if you want to keep the conversation going, just use the hashtag #newsliteracy. So let me start by defining what I mean when I say news literacy. So there's a couple of things that are important to this. The first is we absolutely have to have the ability to be able to trust when something is credible and be able to determine for ourselves whether or not something is credible. And also to determine if something is not, to verify if something is false or is a type of misinformation. When we're talking about being informed, we need to be able to recognize the importance of standards-based authoritative journalism, not just the news organizations, but the journalists, because we have to be able to look at the news, recognize quality news so that we know what we can trust. But we also have to have a high level of confidence that we can share information credibly and reliably, but also act on that information in a way that's responsible. And part of that is interacting with the news, not just consuming it, but interacting with it, sharing it, and making sure that we're using it in a way that is furthering being informed and active in our communities. So I want to emphasize a couple of things about why this is important. So you likely see misinformation every single day, maybe even multiple times a day. But part of what makes that even more complicated is that things that are false are 70% more likely to be shared on social media, especially to be tweeted, than true stories. And falsehoods spread farther and faster than things that are true. 6 times. It takes a true story 6 times as long to reach 1,500 people. And in addition, the true stories, news stories, don't get shared nearly as much as false stories do. And part of that has to do with the current landscape of information, the sheer volume of information that's being shared. This is adapted from a chart done by Lori Lewis and Chad Callahan. It's called the 2020 Internet Minute. This is an average of what is being sent in a single minute right now in 2020. 19 million text messages. People are watching 4.7 million YouTube videos. There's almost 195,000 tweets being sent every minute. And this volume is only increasing across the board. So there is a great deal of information and it gets shared so fast and so easily. And so we have to be aware of things like this. So this is a photo that somebody posted on Facebook claiming that they had received 4 ballots and they get to vote 4 times, trying to feed into a lot of the misinformation around mail-in voting. The reality is, these aren't ballots. These are applications for ballots. And even if the person did receive 4 of them, that doesn't mean they get to vote 4 times, right? Easily disproven. But the problem is when you look at when I took the screenshot, this particular post, just one post, had been shared 10,000 times. So you can imagine the compounding effect of all those 10,000 shares, how many more people saw it as a result. We also have misleading videos. So this was a selectively edited video clip of former Vice President Joe Biden that was edited to make it look like he was waving at an empty field. He wasn't. He was actually waving at a group of firefighters and airport personnel who were in the background. But this one had been seen, had been liked, thumbs up by over 20,000 people. And this account alone has 10,000 subscribers. So the types of edited videos are common. We also have things like this, which is a straight up fake tweet. So this account called Rogue White House Senior Advisor made this fake tweet, and there's apps and websites where it's easy to make, making it look like President Trump had tweeted this out in response to the scene from Borat's new movie. But you can see that this one had over 5,000 likes, 671. Well, no, that's the fake tweet. The actual tweet, 2.6 thousand retweets, 1.2 thousand quote tweets, and over almost 7,500 likes. This went massively viral, but more importantly, other people shared this piece of false information. And then we also have things like rumors. This one was shared over 5,000 times on Facebook, claiming that McDonald's was taking down the American flags and they were going to put up Antifa and Black Lives Matter flags. Completely false. And so one of the things I want to emphasize is that we can't get hung up on social media or social media specific platforms. When we're talking about these skills that I'm going to talk about this afternoon, evaluating information, evaluating content, evaluating the source of the information is what the skills are, not the platform. Because the reality is we can see misinformation literally anywhere. It could be on bumper stickers. It could be a stencil on the sidewalk. It could be a flyer posted on a street pole. So these skills are about the content and the source of information. So one of the questions I want you to ask yourself and think about this is that if one of these showed up in your social media feed, do you right now feel confident that you would be able to verify these claims for yourself? If you are thinking that you may not feel very confident, hopefully by the time we're done this afternoon, that confidence level will go up. So let's talk about some skills. And as Alana mentioned, I will pause at a couple points for questions. So please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box as we go along. The first set of skills I'm going to talk about is about the ways and understanding how and why misinformation manipulates us, right? Because that's what it's doing. When we believe something that turns out to not be true, that misinformation manipulated us in some very specific ways. So first off is about emotional reaction. So this is an image that was posted to Facebook claiming that former Vice President Joe Biden took a knee during the national anthem. When we took this screenshot, it had been shared over 2,000 times. It's gone massively viral. It's still being shared, but it's actually not true. So thinking about this image, you can imagine the different kinds of emotional reactions people might have. There are some who would see this and they would have a deep anger at the idea that he took a knee during the national anthem. Depending on your perspective, you might not have much at all. You might be ambivalent. You might be curious, like what's really going on here? I'm not sure. Or you could feel maybe even happy or proud, like good for him, he took a knee. But the thing is, like, these emotional reactions are designed to get us to believe this to be true without really thinking about it, because that's what's happening. Misinformation, first and foremost, uses our emotions against us. Because what happens is when we have a strong emotional reaction, the emotion centers of our brains are overriding our rational thought processes. And so what it's trying to get us to do is to simply have a reaction. And if it's on social media, that reaction is to reach out and hit that share button, that like button, that retweet button. In our work, we emphasize that teens are especially vulnerable, as are older adults, especially those over the age of 65. For teens, for adolescents, it has to do with brain development. The executive functions part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that really deals with, rational decisions, weighing long-term consequences, that's not really developed until the early to mid 20s. So for adolescents, depending on the age, they're really primarily using the emotion centers of their brains. And for older adults, in many cases, this is also one of the first parts of the brain to start to decline. But also, more importantly, though, older adults have much more deeply held beliefs about political and social issues. And so when they see something that ties to that, they're going to have an emotional reaction. And because it's tied to something that they have these long held and deeply held beliefs, they're also very easily manipulated. And so you can imagine how that happens, because any emotion can be used to manipulate us. In political misinformation, we do see a lot of anger, we see a lot of fear, but could also be something that makes us laugh, like satire, for example. People fall for satire because they laugh at something, or maybe they're angry, but they laugh at something, and in that emotion, they might believe it's true. But there's a number of other ways that our emotions can be used against us. But one of the things I also want to emphasize is we can't just call all misinformation fake news. Fake news used to have a clear definition, but it's been weaponized and politicized, and now it's really a catch-all term, and it's most often used either A, by somebody who's being dismissive, saying, I don't agree with that, I don't like it, or people are using it ironically. But there's a lot of different types of misinformation, but regardless of what type it is or how it's created, it can overwhelm us and make us less likely to trust information. So why do people do this? So why is this a problem? So there's a lot of different reasons behind this, but one of the things that we have to try to figure out is about intent, which can be very difficult because sometimes we can't always know why someone creates something. But one of the things that's important to remember is that the intent behind misinformation is different for people who create misinformation and people who share it. And then the people who share it often can have different intentions as well. So by looking at intent and looking at motivation, it does influence how we respond emotionally to things, but it can also help us get to a better understanding. So there's several different ways. Some people are doing it as a way of trying to make money, either using it to promote a website to get ad revenue, or even could be a scam. Could be somebody who's out there just trying to make problems just because they can. But more importantly, and perhaps more dangerously in some ways, we see it in terms of our politics, that people are using misinformation to either promote their particular political or social cause or to damage the other side. And in most extreme cases, we do see misinformation and disinformation being used deliberately to try to undermine our trust in our democracy and our democratic processes. So some examples, we also have these types of propagators. So the self-interest, making money, we see this with people who are trying to scam us. Clickbait farming is, where people are just trying to get clicks on headlines and articles to generate ad revenue. The group interest, we see this in our politics in particular. We're trying to benefit a group or a political or social cause. We see it with political candidates and elected officials. But it's also important to remember that sometimes people do share misinformation out of a sense of altruism. They're genuinely sharing something they think is important and needs to be shared. And this is mostly ordinary people. And then we do have the trolls, the malicious propagators who are out there sharing the most dangerous misinformation. We see it with like the hyper-partisan extremists. We see it with dangerous health information and misinformation from conspiracy theories. So just a couple of quick examples. So this is recently a scam that the FTC notified people about, that people are getting this text message saying you have a package waiting. This is trying to get us to be curious and hopeful and like, oh, I wonder what's going on here. And if you click on the link, it's actually going to try to steal your personal information. This is a false rumor that was made up claiming that Biden is going to tax our 401ks if he's elected. It's completely false rumor, but people are putting this out there because they're trying to damage former Vice President Biden and try to get people to not vote for him. Altruism. This was a rumor that went viral early in the pandemic, back in, about in April-ish. People were sharing this idea that if you put your mask in the microwave, you could sanitize it. It's actually a complete false rumor. But one of the things that made it dangerous is that people were not only sharing it, but people were trying it, to the point that fire departments around the country were putting out public notices saying, hey, don't put your mask in the microwave. You can actually set your microwave on fire. And there were several fires reported around the country specifically as a result of this misinformation. So please don't microwave your masks. And then we see the malicious, right? So here's an example of a deeply deep political belief, trying to damage the reputation of Amy Coney Barrett prior to being confirmed as the latest Associate Supreme Court Justice. Okay, so I'm just going to pause here really quick before I move into this next one to see if there are any questions about misinformation, about the motivations and whatnot. So I'll just pause here for a quick second to see.
Hi, John. I'm going to chime in here because we did get an interesting question that I'd love to ask you, which says, every example so far has been fake news from the right. Do you have stats showing the breakdown of right versus left? Like, is most of the fake news coming from the right?
I didn't think they were all from the right. Misinformation is not you can find misinformation from across the political spectrum. Just like people are making up rumors about former Vice President Biden, people are making up things about former President Trump. So that fake tweet, so many people made that fake tweet to damage President Trump. It was posted on that went viral on that rogue senior White House advisor account, right? That's an example because President Trump, obviously, as you all know, he does tweet a lot. And so when somebody creates a fake tweet, it looks authentic at first glance, but it's really easy to make that. And when it hits a particular political viewpoint, people believe it very easily. So you see a lot of fake tweets about President Trump in particular, but also there was a fake rumor that went around a while back saying that President Trump had said that he had hundreds of governors calling him about the pandemic, which was not, it wasn't true at all, but it was designed to do that. So there's a lot of misinformation across the political spectrum.
Thank you. There's one other question, and that is, how do you define the difference between misinformation and disinformation?
Okay. The differences between misinformation and disinformation really comes down to intent. Disinformation is something that is, it's false information that is deliberately created and shared knowingly that it's false. Misinformation can have a lot of different intentions behind it. So somebody can share something and not realizing that it's false. So disinformation can become misinformation if you can determine intent. And the reverse is true. You might see something that you know is false, and you may share it anyway, knowing that it's false because you're trying to spread it. So really, that's one of the key things between mis and disinformation is the intention. It's you're knowingly sharing something that is false.
So there's so many questions coming in. I'm not sure. Do you want to continue with the presentation?
Let's take one more.
Okay. So this one comes from Mark, and he says, at some point, can you talk about fake bots on Twitter, and also how many followers are also fake?
Yeah, so a bot is, if you're not familiar with the term bot, a bot is it's basically an automated Twitter account. There are some bots that are out there that are programmed to do a lot of different things. Like one of my favorites, actually, there is a bot that is designed to tweet anytime a Wikipedia article is edited from an IP address registered to the United States Congress. So if it's an IP address in the House or the Senate, or affiliated with the Congress, like an official network, if someone makes an edit to a Wikipedia page, the bot puts out a tweet about what the edit was, which was kind of fascinating. But other bots are designed to amplify, in particular, misinformation. And so it is a major problem on Twitter. They are getting much better at identifying them and removing them if they recognize them as bots, and B, if they are designed to spread mis and disinformation. There are some bot checker websites out there that you can, if you put in a Twitter account, some of these websites will analyze the accounts to see if they are exhibiting bot-like behavior. But sometimes it's not always easy to recognize right off the bat. There are some articles out there that you can use that sort of give you some warning signs, but there are also some really great tools to help you check. Okay.
Thanks, John.
So we'll get to more of the questions in a bit. So the next big skill that I want to emphasize is about differentiating news from opinion. Now, it may sound simple on its surface. Yeah, I know what news is, I know what an opinion is, but the reality is when we look at especially major news organizations, in particular television news organizations, the content is overwhelmingly focused on opinion and commentary. And we often miss the distinctions because the transition back and forth between news and opinion is often so seamless we don't even notice it. But we need to recognize the key differences is that news is trying to inform us. It's trying to tell us the who, the what, the where, the when. Whereas opinions are trying to persuade us. They're trying to get us to come around to a particular point of view. And if we're trying to be reliably informed, we need to recognize that if we're going to be informed from news, that news has to come from reputable sources that follow the standards of quality journalism. In particular, information that is presented has been verified. And that verification has come from multiple quality sources. It could be official sources, eyewitnesses, it could be from documentation, but there are multiple sources that are verifying the information. That information is presented in a way that's fair, that it's presenting particular viewpoints, so for example, if it's an article about something that the government is doing, the government in some way needs to have a way of responding to it. In that information that's being shared, we also need all the important contextual and background information that we need to fully understand what's going on. And the news organizations and the journalists themselves need to follow important standards of accountability and transparency. And so, for example, if they make a mistake, they have to issue a correction and acknowledge the mistake and issue the correction so that we know what the correct information is. And transparency has to do with, we need to know how they're doing things, what their processes are, but also things like the relationship between the news organization and the subject of a news story. So one classic example, if the Washington Post is doing an article about Amazon, somewhere in that news article, they must mention that Jeff Bezos, who is the owner of Amazon, also owns the Washington Post. And those standards of accountability need to be available for us to sort of see it also. When we talk about opinion pieces, though, in a lot of ways, it's easier to see reputable organizations will signpost or label their pieces appropriately. So we'll see that it's an opinion piece or commentary, or it's offering perspective, right? There's a label that tells us what it is. The tone and the language that's used either in the article or in the the video or the audio, right? It's different. It's in the first person. It's going to have superlatives. It's going to have exaggeration and maybe hyperbole because it's trying to be persuasive. And so that's a key difference. And so, yes, if we're trying to learn what the viewpoints are about an issue, we can look for opinion pieces. But if we want to learn for ourselves and try to reach our own conclusion, we need to be looking for news that's giving us the information in following those standards. Okay, so I'm going to go into the next topic. So here's where I'm going to pull up the chat box so I can see it. So what's going to happen here is I'm going to show you 3 headlines, and what we're going to do is we're just going to have a brief little thing. You put something in the chat. I'm going to ask you about whether or not you perceive bias in these headlines, and also compare the 3 headlines. So these are all from the same news event earlier this year. So this is the first headline. It says USS Theodore Roosevelt commander relieved of duty. So my question simply is, do you perceive bias in this headline? And so if you feel like you have an opinion, you can put yes or no. If you want to mention what you think. So B says no. Martin also says no. Caressa says no. Okay. Okay, Arik says yes, it doesn't tell the whole story. Okay. All right, so I'm going to show you a second headline, same news event, different news source. So this one says, Navy removes aircraft carrier captain who raised alarm about coronavirus response. So the question here is this more biased? Is it less biased? Or is it about the same as the first one? More. Okay, Judith says more. Brooks says more. Okay, a couple more people. Dominic says less. More. Same. Tracy says it's same. No bias. Okay. Better headline, more informed. Slightly more. Okay. I'm going to give you the third one. Last one. Same thing. Commander of aircraft carrier hit by coronavirus removed for poor judgment after sounding the alarm. So again, more, less, or about the same. Aaron says definitely more. Okay. Way more. Yes. More. Okay. This one is clickbait. You want to know more? Good. Okay. Definitely some strong feelings about this. Okay. So let's look at all 3. So thinking about this, which one would you say is most biased? Number 1, number 2, or number 3? I think from the previous comments, most people are going to say 3. Okay. So here's the thing. These headlines raise some important questions that we have to address when we're talking about bias. So the first thing is, I was asking you about perception, right? So the thing is that all of us can look at these headlines and perceive bias differently. So one of the things is that we want to talk about is if we're talking about bias, we have to get away from perception, and we have to try to get to a more objective way of evaluating it. And some of these are some questions that have to come up. So first off, one question is, are these all straight news pieces, right? Because if these were opinion pieces, then questions of bias it's a pointless discussion, because opinion pieces by their very nature are meant to be biased. Are these factual and accurate? Right? Are what they're putting in there? Are these important details that have been verified? If we say they're biased, can we actually explain what type of bias? And are we projecting our own biases on these headlines in some way? So one of the things you will note is that I didn't tell you where these headlines came from. So I'm going to show you where these come from. And I want to sort of get your thoughts now about these headlines, seeing the news sources. So the very first one was from Fox News. The second was from the Washington Post. And the third, the one that most people said was the most biased, came from CNN. So I'm kind of curious if anyone has thoughts on that, seeing where they come from. Aaron says his mind is blown. So Martin in the chat says, how do I define bias? That's, so we define, when we're talking about media bias, we're generally talking about information that's being presented in a way that's generally unfair or slanted in some way. Jan says the use of quotation marks is significant. Yeah. So the thing is, one of the questions we would have to ask is that, quote, poor judgment. Yeah. So the thing is, that's actually a reason why the Navy said that they had removed that captain from duty. But there's a lot of other things that are important to this, right? So one of the things we would want to ask about is like, so the standards of writing headlines and these different organizations. You know, some organizations tend to lead more towards brevity, you know, keeping headlines short and focused, where others add more details. And this is going to be something we're going to talk about more in a minute, about headlines in particular. So here are some of the ways that we define types of bias. So we have a lesson that teachers can use with students called Understanding Bias. So we've sort of defined these 5 types. And so this is in news pieces. So for example, demographic bias. This is where, you know, issues of demographics can affect news coverage. So for example, where we only, if we focus only on, you know, particular, if it's only men represented in an article, if ways that, you know, different ways that we're covering types of things. Corporate bias, there's a lot of accusations of corporate bias in the news today. You know, the corporate ownership of news, how does that influence? Can you actually specifically identify corporate influence as opposed to just, you know, perception? But there's also what we call the 5 forms. This is where we actually see where we can usually identify the most bias in news, right? So for example, it could be like flawed sourcing, a news piece that actually doesn't have quality sources or only relies on 1 or 2 and excludes sources. Tone is also very common about the types of words that we use, right? How do we, when we're talking about immigration, right? Are we talking about undocumented immigrants? Are we talking about illegal aliens, right? There's that. Story selection is also an important issue when we talk about news media bias. What stories are being covered and to what degree? You know, when we see hurricanes get massive amounts of coverage, but as you all know, you know, the West Coast and the Northwest is on fire, and there's a major discrepancy in how, especially national news organizations, cover those. There are some charts out there that are often very commonly used, but there are some challenges with these. So these charts are trying to map out news organizations based on political bias. There's a couple of issues with these. The one on the left is one of the most common that people see. One of my major issues with this is that you see organizations like InfoWars and Patriotics that put out blatant misinformation, and in some, like in the case of InfoWars, they spread conspiracy theories. We're trying to chart them with an organization like the Associated Press, right? So it's really unfair to compare all these organizations by the same chart. And in some cases, it doesn't differentiate between the news reporting and the opinion writing and such. So these could be a good starting point, but there's some things that we have to be aware of. Our perceptions of news organizations heavily influence these charts. And it's really, they really focus on opinion pieces, but many of these sources don't even try to report straight news. They're all about commentary and propaganda, and in some cases, even conspiracy theory. And they're very subjective. There's a lot of ways that we can debate these rankings. And bias is a very complex, very nuanced topic. And these charts, I think, in a lot of ways, oversimplify this issue. Okay, so next one is about evaluating posts and claims for evidence. So we see a lot of things that show up on our social media feeds trying to make a claim. We need to be able to recognize when they're actually supported by evidence. So this is an example of a post where somebody said that with this image that not a single Democrat had showed up for a committee hearing on border security, and you can see that the empty seats are circled. But the reality is, like, we have no way of verifying this image that it's actually from that particular board, that particular committee. This obviously they've already photoshopped this image by circling things, so we don't know what else has been photoshopped. This actually isn't evidence. Compare that with this tweet from the Pew Research Center talking about people, how they identify politically. We have two very important things that the other one didn't. First, we have the chart that we can see the data that's charted out, but also we can click on the link and we can get more information about the post. And one of the things that we have to be asking ourselves is some questions. Especially if there's a big claim that connects to something we believe in. So these questions are adapted from the Stanford History Education Group. Who's the source of the claim? What is their credibility? Is there evidence? Can I evaluate the evidence? Can I evaluate the credibility of the source of that evidence? If I determine those things are credible, then I have to look at the connection between the evidence and the claim and see that if it's proven. But the reality is, if you can't verify the credibility of the source or the credibility of the evidence, then you can pretty much discount it. And it's important to remember the role of emotion in this as well, that sometimes if you're having an emotional response to something, chances are it's trying to mislead you in some way. Whereas you can see the one on the right, you might be curious, but it's not really trying to manipulate you through emotion. Part of what we have to think about is checking our reasoning and being aware of how we're doing things. One of the biggest things we have to watch out for is what's called motivated reasoning. This is related to cognitive dissonance, where we're using emotion-based reasoning when something we believe in is being challenged with contradictory information. Like, that's not comfortable. And so in that moment of the cognitive dissonance of being uncomfortable, we may latch on to only finding things that will confirm what we already believe, and we'll reject anything that contradicts. So motivated reasoning is this flawed style of reasoning, whereas I'm only going to go out and look for information that will reinforce and tell me that what I believe is true. And I'm going to ignore anything that might challenge what I believe. So the motivation is, I want to prove myself right. And I will latch onto and I'll believe anything that will do that. Because it's that emotional connection to something that we believe in. And so it's a couple of warning signs. If all you're doing is searching for things to prove something true, right? That's not critical thinking, right? If you're only getting your information in particular from closed social media groups, which we call echo chambers, there's a lot of these closed groups on Facebook where all they do is share information that already reinforces what people believe. So one of the examples I usually use is, for example, it's related to who I'm talking with today. Facebook used to have a major problem with Holocaust denial groups. And in those groups, all you would see is any information that can be used to support this assertion that the Holocaust never happened. Now, fortunately, Facebook is getting rid of those slowly but surely. They've gotten rid of a lot of them. But those echo chambers are where you only hear and see information that reinforces. If you prioritize sources that you think align with your political or social beliefs and ignore others, you're engaging in confirmation bias. And if you're just readily accepting anything that agrees with you and you're not doing any verification, chances are you're engaging in some motivated reasoning. So the most important thing I want to emphasize there is you can't let what you believe become a fact. Facts can be proven, and facts don't need you to believe in them, because facts just are. I'm going to show you a couple really quick fact-checking skills, and then I'll pause again for questions. There's 3 that I want to show you really quickly. So one of the first ones is about critical observation, simply using your eyeball. So taking a look at this image from earlier, we're talking about former Vice President Biden taking a knee. If you just look closely at the image, so what in this image indicates that it might not have been taken during the national anthem? So I'll just ask if anybody sees anything in the image. If you want to just put something in the chat, take a quick look. What in this image, taking a look at it, right? So says their hands not on their hearts, right? So even if Joe Biden was kneeling, Dr. Biden certainly would have had her hand over her heart. The dancers look like they're posing. This image was actually taken in Miami, in the little Haiti area of Miami about a week or so ago. So yeah, so we can just looking on the faces of it, this doesn't look like it was taken during the national anthem. Yeah, people are doing different things. So just looking at something like that, you can sort of see how it falls apart, but you have to use that critical observation. Also handy with images is called a reverse image search. So here's a piece of misinformation that was tweeted recently by Eric Trump, claiming that 50 Cent and Ice Cube were wearing these hats supporting President Trump. So what a reverse image search is, it's a specialized search that's trying to match pixel patterns to find either matching or similar images. There's several different ways of doing this. One of the easiest is in the browser. So I'm using Chrome and Google as my default search engine. All major browsers have this function. If you right click, a menu pops up. It says search Google for image. And what it's going to do is it's going to upload that image to the database, and it's going to try to find matching images. So the first two things that pop up, first we have a fact check from USA Today specifically about it, telling us that the photo has been altered. Fox News has a news article that also talks about it. If we go down, we can see similar images trying to compare. A lot of the images that seem relevant, if you look at them, they also seem to have the Trump on there. So we don't necessarily know what those images are tied to. But we also have to be careful because one of the links is a link to Eric Trump's original tweet. It's actually since been deleted. But we can also see a link to Ice Cube, and it looks like a similar picture. And if we click on that, we can actually verify for ourselves that they were not wearing Trump hats. The third, so you can also download apps that do reverse image searches from your phones. You want to look for apps that are highly rated. There's a number of them out there. You want to make sure that they do a reverse image search, but you also want to make sure that they have what's called multi-search engine capability so that they can search multiple databases. The third skill is lateral reading. So lateral reading is a term that was, it came out of research by Sam Weinberg and Sarah McGrew at the Graduate School of Education. The idea of lateral reading is if you want to verify something, you have to get off of that, open up a browser tab, and you're going to start searching for information. And you're going to try to verify the credibility of what you're reading by doing some deliberate searching. And you keep searching until you are confident that you've either verified something to be true or you verified that it's false. So I'm used this one. This was a false claim about President Trump shortly after he was released from the hospital at Walter Reed. This false claim went viral, claiming that he was carrying a portable oxygen concentrator and he had an oxygen line up through his mask. So doing a reverse image or lateral reading here, we're gonna do a strategic search. We're gonna try to exercise what's called click restraint, which means we're not gonna click on the first link that pops up. We're gonna review the results and we're gonna try to pick the sources that seem the most relevant so that we can have confidence in what we're reading, that it's true or not. So here, I'm going to phrase it in the form of a question. That's one way of doing it. You can put key phrases in quotation marks so that it looks for that exact phrase. You want to be sure that you're spelling everything properly, and you want your search to be as specific and detailed as possible so that you're getting good results. So here, when I ask this in the form of a question, the search engine algorithms are recognizing that it's a fact check, showing me some sources. But if I scroll down, these are just general news stories about the president's health, about his oxygen levels, and these are not relevant. So one of the things I'll just mention about fact check organizations before I take some additional questions is there's a lot of different ones out there. The reputable fact check organizations are the ones that show their work, meaning that they give us all the evidence that they found, that we can evaluate the evidence for ourselves. They give us enough detail and contextual and background information so that we understand everything. Reputable organizations, they tell us about how they do things, what's their methodology, what are their best practices, how do they get their ratings. And it's often important to use more than one. Okay, so I'll just pause here before I just mention the very last thing. There's one more skill, but I know we're running a little short on time, so I want to pause here to see if there are some questions.
So John, we have quite a few questions, and I want to start with one that came from Rob. And he asks, is an unnamed source considered valid in news?
That's a great question. Yeah, there's a lot of misperceptions about unnamed sources. most commonly and inaccurately referred to as anonymous sources. So the thing that you have to recognize is that sometimes unnamed sources are important, but they're not anonymous to the journalist or the news organization, right? Someone, that journalist and someone, usually an editor or more than one, they know the identity of that source, and they have an agreement. They understand why that person is remaining unnamed. And we should know that from the story that we're reading, because sometimes people are sharing things because they fear reprisal. They may be sharing things because they're not authorized to share things. There's a number of reasons for it, but we should know that in looking at it. But unnamed sources should only be used in only the most like limited circumstances. But also, reputable news organizations should have a policy that we can evaluate about how and when they use unnamed sources.
So there's another question here from Anonymous, who asks, how many Americans get their information from only one news source? And how many Americans only get their news source from Fox News?
I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. What I do know is that in general, because there are so many sources of information and news out there, there is a sort of general behavior for a lot of people to try to limit, what they get. So one of the key differences is for a lot of adults, they have a go-to like news channel or primary news source, maybe another one. But I think we could probably there is probably some research out there that tells us how many viewers Fox has, how many visitors to their websites. It's something that's very difficult to quantify though, because we can see viewership, but that doesn't tell us how many viewers only watch Fox. So it's a moving target. But I think in general, I think there's a general trend in a lot of our behaviors that we prioritize sources of information that generally agree with us politically and socially, because that's what we probably are more likely to watch and read. But it's a difficult thing to quantify.
So, John, this next question comes from Andrea, and you and I were talking a little bit about this before this program, and I hope maybe you'll expand on it on some of the current work you're doing also. But Andrea asks, is it a folly to try to dialogue with a QAnon follower or friend?
It depends on how deeply into QAnon or other conspiracy theories they are. So people who believe in conspiracy theories are the deepest into the cognitive dissonance, and in many cases, in extreme cases, really have lost the capacity for rational thought about the belief in the conspiracy theory. The challenge is that the more you believe in it, the more that belief becomes part of your identity. And when a belief is closely tied to your identity, it's going to be that much more difficult to confront. I think you can try to present information to a QAnon follower for them to sort of see. Unfortunately, most people who are deeply into conspiracy theories, they have to find their way out of it themselves. You can try to guide them, you can try to share information. I think the most important thing you have to recognize is that you have to approach people like that with empathy. Because they believe what in these things. They believe that that it's true. It is a very strong belief. They are being manipulated. They're being exploited in some ways. They are deep down rabbit holes, and it's a self-reinforcing belief. And so we have to recognize that most people didn't go down this path intentionally. They got down there. They started down the path, and then were manipulated into believing deeper and deeper. And so you have to approach it with a position of empathy, that you're going to try to help them see the way out. You shouldn't be confrontational, because that'll just backfire.
I really like that idea that you need to approach them with empathy, that this is part of their identity. John, I think you've given us a lot to think about today. Thank you so much for.
Can I just go through this one last thing really quick?
Of course.
It's actually really quick, but this is one of the most important things I want people to take away. We have to click the links. So here's an example. This was a tweet that's been put out several times. It's an article from NPR saying, "Why doesn't America read anymore?" People had a lot of thoughts, a lot of comments, a lot of opinions about why people don't read. Problem is they didn't click on it to realize that it was an April Fool's joke, because the reality is almost 60% of links that are shared on Twitter, people don't actually click on them and read them, but they fill in the blanks based on the tweet and the headline. And they think they know what they're talking about. They comment on it, they argue on it, but they never actually read it. Here's an example. Earlier this year, this news story was posted that there was a bill in Vermont that would ban the use of cell phones for everyone under the age of 21. ABC posted it, CBS posted it, or CNN posted it, major news organizations. People had thoughts, they had ideas, they had problems with it. Some people thought it was great. But the reality is they didn't read the article to realize that it was posted. The bill was sponsored by a guy who was trying to make a point about Vermont's gun control legislation. So the thing is, you have to click on the articles. You have to read the articles. You should not post and share and comment on things that you haven't actually read, because it's a major problem right now. Lots of people are doing this. And so we have to get to the point where we're doing that. And so the last thing is we are part of the solution, all of us together. Before you share something, make sure you verified that you know what you're sharing, you verified that it's true, and you're going to be part of this to help stand up for facts.
Great advice. Thank you so much, and so important, of course, to read the articles before we share them, know what we're passing on out there.
We have a number of resources. I'll just drop a link in the chat really quick. You can just go to our website, newslit.org. If you would like to find additional resources and information from the News Literacy Project. I'll also send some things to Alana, so she can also send some things out in a follow-up email if she can.
Definitely, and I'll post them on our website as well.
Great.
Yeah, thank you so much. Just a reminder to everyone who's watching, this program was recorded, so if there's something you want to go back and see, or if you want to share it with someone else, you'll find the link on our website starting tomorrow, along with all of our other past Lunch and Learn programs. It takes a dedicated team to keep the Holocaust Center running at full speed with virtual presentations from our Speakers Bureau, professional development programs for teachers, one of which is on Thursday with John, creating new online resources, offering book discussions, our student leadership board, and our new virtual field trips. I want to give a special thank you to Richard Green, our museum and technology director, who's running the technical side of this show. Also, a huge thank you to our executive director, Dee Simon, and our entire team, Nicole Bella, Lori Werschel-Cohen, Julia Thompson, Paul Regelbrug, Rosa Campos, Sydney Drato, Ellie Selesky, Amanda Davis, and Katie Lawrence. And thank you also to Michelle Quinones, who provided closed captioning for us today. Be sure to join us next week with Hannah Kern, who's a member of our Speakers Bureau and the daughter of one of the few Jewish children to survive the Camp Theresienstadt in Czechoslovakia. You can find more information on our website. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you again, John, and we look forward to seeing you next Tuesday.
Great.
Thanks a lot. This concludes our program.